Hey everybody, it is Professor Parish, and we are on week 6 of English 122. So I will be honest, everybody, I have been away from my computer all weekend, and so I've not gotten a chance to get a head start on grading. So this week I will be a little bit later getting graded your assignments for week 5, especially your papers, because I want to take time on those. So you will probably get your papers back with my feedback by the end of the week. So I'm recording this on Sunday morning. So if you've not submitted your paper 1 draft, please make sure that you do so tonight. Make sure you have the other assignments completed. Remember, you don't get a chance to submit late, so make sure you do everything on time. But it will probably take me all week to get through everybody's papers, so just be patient with me. You should get feedback throughout the week on your papers. Don't worry about that. So with that being said, I do want to talk about week 6. So we're starting we've spent a lot of time on short story, and I do that for a couple reasons. We spend a lot of time on the first and last units, with the research paper being the last unit and short story being the first unit. And the reason why is because first, I like to give you a week or two to get settled into the class, to get your textbook, to get used to Canvas, things like that. So we start out a little slow. We do take some time with poetry, which is our new unit. And then drama, we don't spend a lot of time on drama, and we'll get to that later on in the semester around Thanksgiving. But with short story, we spend quite a bit of time because there's a lot of setup. There's a lot of terminology. The 7 elements of short story, I think you will keep seeing as we go through poetry and drama. You'll see those elements. They'll just be tweaked and have terms added to them that apply more to poetry and drama respectively. So short story and its elements and terminology kind of build a foundation in this class, and then the other terms that come from it kind of stem from those same 7 elements. So it's kind of cool. It's neat to see, like, it starts out with a base and then it slowly spreads out and expands as we get the other genres included. But let's go ahead and talk about Module 6. So with this module, we're going to start out like easing into poetry, because I realize poetry is not everyone's favorite genre. Usually students either really like poetry or they're terrified of it. And I think the reason people are terrified of it is because it's so subjective, right? With a short story, there's a clear beginning, middle, and end. With poetry, you don't know if you're going to get that. It may have a narrative structure. It may just be about a second in time. An entire poem can be about a leaf or a grain of rice or something so specific. And sometimes poetry has very deep spiritual or emotional meanings, and sometimes it's just for fun. It's so varied. But the thing I love about poetry is it truly is the best of language. People that can write poetry, you're using the most specific words possible and the best word choice that you can to convey these emotions and feelings. So it's really kind of neat, right? Poetry is very, very interesting, and I think a lot of people use poetry as a therapeutic method. So because it's so emotional and because you can get so involved in it, a lot of people write poetry to just like ease anxiety or to use as therapy. I know as an angsty high schooler back in the day, I wrote lots of emotional poetry that I look back on and go, that was terrible. But it was a way to, vocalize your thoughts. And it's a way to get that out on paper so that you're not just stewing over them. So a lot of people use poetry and writing as a therapy process, which is really good. So the readings that we have for this week are talking about how to read a poem, because reading poetry is different than reading fiction or nonfiction. It very much is a different process. So pages 692 through 706 in our textbook talk about the process of reading a poem and how you can kind of break it down and analyze the words differently, think about the pattern, think about how it's formulated, all that good stuff. And then on page 707, there's a section about listening to a voice. We are actually going to listen to some poetry in this unit through our discussion forums. Because spoken poetry and read poetry are 2 very different things. And it's kind of crazy and cool how it transitions between reading a poem to hearing it said out loud, because the rhythm is there, there's a musicality to it. It's very, very interesting. So we're going to kind of go through that in this unit, which I'm really excited about. And then the first major theme of poetry is the words themselves, because like I said, poetry is language at its best. You have to choose the best words possible to convey emotions and imagery. And this chapter on words on page 731 goes through that process. So those are the 3 sections of reading to look at this week. I think that my goal is if you hate poetry, my goal by the end of this unit is that you will appreciate poetry. You may not like it, but you'll at least respect it and understand it. That's my goal for this unit. So we have that. There are 2 assignments. We're going to go over the paper 2 guidelines here in a moment. The 2 assignments are, first of all, the discussion forum, which I've pulled up here. So with this, there's a video on poetry and what makes a poem. It's just a basic introduction video, but I think if you're not familiar with poetry, it'll be interesting enough. So just watch the video, and then the questions for it are, according to the video, what makes a poem a poem? What defines poetry? Why do you think people dislike poetry? I mentioned some reasons here, but you can elaborate on them in your discussion post, or vice versa. Why do you think people enjoy it? And then my other question is, what do you hope to learn about poetry in this unit? So everybody comes from different high schools. Everybody comes from different backgrounds. So I want to know kind of what is your experience with poetry? Did you do a lot of poetry in high school? I did not. My high school English teachers were not focused on poetry. They were more literature based. So I didn't experience poetry really until I got into college and took college poetry classes for my undergrad. So I didn't really have a major experience with poetry until the college level, but I'm curious to know with you all, if your high school or if you're homeschooled, did you do any poetry classes? Have you ever gone to a poetry reading? Have you ever written poetry? What do you hope to learn about it? What's your experience with it? So that's the discussion forum. And then the paper 2 thesis and outline. We're going to talk about the guidelines here in just a second, but the thesis and outline is exactly like what you did for paper 1. It's just a bare bones skeletal outline where you explain to me the points of your paper, and then also tell me the thesis. So which option did you choose for paper 2? We'll go over that in a moment. Which option did you pick? What are you thinking about talking about? Again, these are all work in progress. So your outline and thesis here is just what you think that you're going to do. Now, obviously, that can change, right? Because you've got some weeks to work on this paper. So I just want to know that you have a structure in place. And if you change that structure, it's not the end of the world, right? And you can always check with me through email if you decide that you're going to do option 1 and then, a week into it as you're writing, you're like, oh, this isn't going to work. You can always email me and be like, hey, Miss Parish, I'm going to change to option 2. Is that okay? And spoiler alert, it will be. But that way you can let me know ahead of time. And if you have any questions, I can hopefully answer them for you as you're writing. So that's going to be the thesis and outline assignment. But yeah, let's talk about paper 2. I will be honest with y'all. This is probably the paper, we have 4 papers in this class. We have nonfiction and fiction. We have poetry, we have drama, and we have a research paper. Our research paper is the longest paper, but I will tell you, most students say that this paper is the one that gives them the hardest time out of all the papers we do in this class, because you have options, but it's requiring you to look at poetry, which is a bit different than other genres of literature. So let's go through this. You have 2 options for this paper. You can either 1, write your own poetry, so you'll construct 2 poems, and then you'll compare and contrast them using terminology from our textbooks chapters on poetry. So basically you'll create 2 poems and then you'll compare and contrast your own work and tell how they're similar and different and explain why you wrote those 2 poems and your inspiration, etc. So you will use terminology from the book, but you're also going to be guided by your own opinions and experiences as a writer. So that's the creative writing option number 1. Option 2 is that you are comparing and contrasting. You're just using 2 poems from our textbook instead of your own. So you can either write 2 poems and compare and contrast them, or you can pick 2 out of our textbook. And I say out of our textbook because our textbook has a ton of poetry. There's so many poems in this book, you really don't have to look anywhere else. You can find 2 poems from here. You can go through the index. If you see a poet that you really like, granted, their poems are probably going to be there. I'm pretty confident you can find 2 really excellent poems from our textbook for this assignment. So either option 1 or option 2. This is where a lot of students get confused. So I'm going to go ahead and clarify. Your paper has to be 3 pages, right? Including your poems. So if you chose option 2, it's 3 pages, regardless. It's just 3 pages of analysis because you're not writing your own poetry. You're comparing and contrasting 2 poems that already exist. So it's 3 pages, just like paper 1. All right. If you chose option 1, you do have to have 2 full pages of analysis at least, and then you have to have at least a page of poems. So you can either choose option 2 where you're writing 3 pages of analysis, or you can choose option 1 where you do at least, you can do more than 2 pages, obviously, but 2 pages of analysis, but there has to be a full page of poetry that you have written. So that's the catch. If you don't like creative writing and you don't think you can write a good poem, I'd choose option 2. If you like creative writing and you think you can make some good poems, then choose option 1. And by good, I mean that you show effort. Obviously, this is not a poetry class. This is not a creative writing class. So I'm not judging you or grading you on the quality of the poem itself necessarily. What I'm grading you on is that you write poetry and you can explain your choices. So if you write haiku, you need to explain that haiku in detail and the terminology and the structure and the formatting. I'm more concerned that you know how the poem is constructed if you chose option 1 than the poem itself, if that makes sense. But obviously, I'm going to be able to tell when I read if you actually made an effort or not. I've read some students' poems and I was like, oh, you just wrote this at the last minute. You didn't put any thought or effort into it because they couldn't explain their decisions, right? They just wrote a poem down. They're like, oh, here's my poem. And I'm like, but why did you choose the words you did? Why did you make these decisions? And if they can't explain it, that's a problem. So your paper should be an essay format, should have an introduction and a conclusion. If you choose option 1 where you make your own poems, I would say the easiest thing to do would be to do your analysis first. Have your intro, your analysis of your 2 poems, your conclusion, and then at the very end, have your page of poetry, if that makes sense. You do need to cite your textbook in MLA. I will require a works cited page for this paper because we need to make sure that everybody knows how to do MLA properly. And I want to see if you know how to do MLA properly so I know how much to go into in depth when we talk about citations and formatting. So you do need to cite your textbook. So you need to have in-text citations, a works cited page. If you've done English 121 here at SIC, you should be familiar with MLA, but make sure that you include that textbook cited. And then if you use any other sources, you need to cite them in MLA as well, but you shouldn't need other sources. You should just have your textbook. And then your works cited page should be separate along with in-text citations. Now, the thesis statement is due this Sunday. The draft is not due until October 17th, so you've got a couple weeks to work on this paper, right? And then if you choose to revise, revisions will be due on Halloween. Haha, festive. So as far as grading goes, it's worth 100 points, like paper 1. Your introduction and conclusion are worth points, the grammar and spelling. The analysis and content are worth a lot of points as well. So make sure that you are explaining the terms from our poetry chapters as you describe your poems. And then formatting and page length will be points as well. So I like this second paper. I think that students have a lot of fun with it if they're doing their own creative writing or even if they just compare and contrast 2 poems. I am curious to know what you all end up doing with it. So if you have questions, please feel free to email me. All right. I'm happy to answer any questions. And as always, we have Miss Joanna Lane, who's our tutor, that can help you go through any specific questions about your paper as well. So yeah, that is the module for this week. Those are our assignments. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me and let me know. Like I said, I was not able to do any grading this weekend like I normally do. So with that being said, I will be grading this week, but your grades may take a little bit longer to update for week 5 than normal. But I will have your papers back to you by the end of the week so you can start making revisions if you choose to do so. Revisions are optional, of course, so if you like your grade, if you've got an A or a B on this first paper, you're fine. If you get a C or below, I would advise revising, and I'll let you know as I grade your papers about that too. So in any case, I hope you all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe, take care, and I'll be back soon with Module 7 of English 122. Bye.